When we think of sex tourism, what comes to mind? Is it exotic beaches, quick money, or exploitation? But what if we're missing the real story here? You know, those stories of love, survival, and the ones that involve power. Well, that's what we're going to get into today. Hey everyone, welcome to today's podcast, Sex, Love, and Tourism, where we aim to understand women's experiences from a feminist perspective. I'm your host, Amy, and in today's episode, An Experience of Mobility, we'll be exploring the lived realities of Latin American women who work in sex tourism. And in doing so, we'll try to understand the motivations behind the work and how they navigate those complexities of love and the need for economic survival and mobility. And also the relationships that these women form with the tourist men that they meet. And I'll also be diving a lot deeper into the understandings of the structural inequalities and the cultural components, such as, those racial hierarchies, economic class components, and cultural concepts of machismo, all of which play a huge role in forming the experiences of Latin American women, who we're going to have at the center of today's discussion. However, do not be mistaken thinking that only white men participate in this, or that men in general participate in this only, because white women are a vast client base for racialized men in the Caribbean. And we're going to use this as a comparison to better understand just how the extent of this structures that I just listed impact the experiences for women, both as workers and as clients. So before we dive in, I ask that we keep this question in mind as we listen and learn together. And that question being, what does it mean to love and to labor emotionally and survive economically in a world that is totally shaped by race, class, and gender? And this is pretty important because this is the kind of questions that sex workers in Latin America really have to ask themselves. All right, so now with that being said, now we can dive in. All right, so what is sex tourism anyway, and what does it even look like in Latin America? So in practice, it basically looks like traveling to another country with the expectation of receiving sex in exchange for goods or money. So like gifts or money in general. And the client is usually a white European or American male. And the sex worker is usually a racialized woman who is either financially disadvantaged or otherwise marginalized. But this doesn't really paint, like that definition, it doesn't really paint the whole picture, specifically from the woman's perspective. Because for the woman, it involves so much more than just sex and money. The experience, it really becomes used as a vehicle for social mobility. And some women might even engage in sex for free, or, de grata, as known in Brazil. And some might actually do it for money or goods as well with tourist men. But the key thing is that they do this with men who they form connections with throughout the tourist trip. And they do it with the hope of creating a long-term relationship in the future. So as we see, sex work to create long-term relationships, social mobility, and security, well, it creates a lot more of a complicated picture than we initially thought. Because sex tourism, it involved a special kind of emotional labor on the part of the woman, where instead of putting up those typical barriers that you think of when you think of a sex worker of no kissing, no hugging, they actually embrace doing those things with male tourists or clients in general. They embrace that with the people who they've met and have those connections with. Because ultimately, that emotional connection, it plays a giant role in a woman's participation, since they do ultimately aspire to form those long-term relationships that sometimes involve moving away and settling down. So, of course, you have to at least like the person, right? And love is very important. And so like, why sex tourism and why Latin America? And, there is a substantial amount of racial diversity in Latin America. So that's why I chose this topic and this region, because it has a history that encompasses, colonialism, cultural constructs of machismo, and the feminization of labor, which I want to get to in a minute. But essentially, these Latin American women, they face a lot of intersectionalities based on their ethnicities and the status of being from the global south, so their citizenship and their gender and being racialized sometimes. And this creates very marginalizing barriers to getting their needs met. And also, we don't often think about this, but the needs of those who they have responsibilities to. So that can be children. And with jobs that pay very little and are very difficult, like factory jobs in the Dominican Republic or domestic work in Brazil, for example, sex work can feel like the only viable option and realistic option that a woman has to actually support her family or even just support herself. But either way, in that case, this means that for a single mother, for example, love is not only it's not only central between the client and the worker, but it's also, involves the love and responsibilities to the people who depend on her, such as those children and family. And the issue with those sensationalist headlines that make claims of exploitation and abuse is that they don't address the barriers or structures in place that keep the industry alive in the first place, meaning that side of the story really goes ignored. And this noise really drowns out the experiences of the women central to sex tourism, which makes for a very limited understanding of the lived realities, motivations, and labor involved. And these are all complexities that I want to bring attention to so that the discussion that we're having doesn't become sensationalist. Or also on the flip side, I also don't want to glorify the trade. So let's explore a bit together and learn together. Alright, so in bringing attention to the labor that these women do in addition to their sex work, I want to discuss and I want to highlight their stories. And I'm going to pull an excerpt from an article I read by Mary Evie Cartier Morrison, and she spent some time in Brazil, Natal, Brazil specifically, with some women involved in sex tourism, and she worked to understand their experiences, which is why I think this is a great source. And I'm specifically going to focus on what a woman named Perla says. And Perla says, and I quote, "I have to feel something, and if I don't, then I don't do it." And that refers to the sex work she engages in. And Perla does not work de grata, but that's still, she still requires that emotional connection with the tourist clients that she works with, because the ultimate goal for these women is to turn these clients into boyfriends and long-term relationships. And now these are all shaped by the need for economic survival and social mobility, which we can see in the ethnography called Gringo Love by the same author, where a character named Carol, I think it's Carol, described a past where she worked for a very wealthy family that took advantage of her and exploited her labor for very little pay. And these barriers really made her feel like she had no future in Brazil. And especially because she stopped going to school when she was just 10 years old. And that left her with very limited options to ser dessa vida, which I think I said that right. And it translates to getting out of this life. And when she says that, she's referring to poverty. And emotional and financial, emotional intimacy and financial necessity, they are really complex. And, these direct examples, they show us just how complicated that battle is for, like I just said, emotional intimacy and economic survival. Because commodifying love, it's not just it becomes a necessity for a means of survival. And we have to kind of realize that sex work in Latin America and all over the place really is very stigmatized, which means that the emotions, that are needed to form these relationships and to legitimize these relationships with the men, They're also required to legitimize the relationships for the women themselves. And these women, they're already marginalized, and they have to deal with other power imbalances, and that can be really distressing for the women. And an example that I witnessed in a separate ethnography by Denise Brennan was where a character named Alina broke down crying after finding that her German tourist client named Jürgen, she had converted him into a boyfriend, he was leaving. He turned into a boyfriend and he was leaving. And because, this happened because at the end of the day, once the tourist leaves, from his trip, the sex workers, they have very little control over where that relationship goes from there. So, like I said, that emotional commodifying love and economic survival, how do they navigate all of this, right? I mean, how do they do that? That sounds complicated. And it is. But in reading Gringo Love, I observed just how much the women use certain phrases, for example. It's like negotiation. They use certain phrases like amigo, namorado, and fazer amor to refer to these tourist men. When I say negotiation, I'm saying that these titles allow for these women to turn these socially stigmatized relationships and transactions into something much less, I guess, controversial. A friend, amigo, boyfriend, namorado, or lover as well. I think that's what it means. I might be wrong on that. I don't speak Portuguese, but and fazer amor, which means to make love. And these are just more than, they do more than just names to navigate that and negotiate these things with themselves, those stigmas and that relationship and the emotional intimacy. They do more. And this can even involve having sex without a condom, believing that it really, might legitimize their relationship and create that more emotional intimacy and that girlfriend experience for the man. And these examples, they show us how women in these situations navigate the complexities of forming emotional bonds and intimacy while seeking social mobility and dealing with that, stigma. And this can all impact a woman's experience. Sometimes these women, they don't even perceive the work that they do as sex work, but either as genuine relationship building or, as in the case in Costa Rica, just services that happen to involve sex. But overall, these men and relationships do kind of become perceived as representations of what these women aspire to achieve, which is social mobility and a middle-class lifestyle. And all of these require love and emotional intimacy beyond sex and money. It goes beyond that. And now I want to draw back to Alina, who is a single racialized mother who needs to provide for her children. So not only does that client become all of that, that stability and middle-class lifestyle, it doesn't just represent that for her, but also for her child, who she loves and aspires for more. That she wants them to get more than they had. And while these relationships, they don't always last, the goal still remains, and they still have to navigate the tricky waters between financial necessity and emotional intimacy to meet that final destination of marriage, maybe, and immigration, move to another country perhaps, and escape from those societal constructs that limit theirs and their children's social mobility and economic freedom, essentially their ability to ser de esa vida. Alright, so let's move away from emotional labor and love just for a moment, and let's discuss race, because it plays a huge role in the sex tourism industry. And I want to, remind us that Latin America has settler colonial history with ties back to slavery. In this context, it helps us understand those barriers that people with intersecting identities face, given the racial hierarchies. And, we often don't think of it, but, the white supremacy in Latin America. And to illustrate that white supremacy, because I don't want to just say that without any backing. I'm going to pull a quote from an article which focuses on sex tourism in Costa Rica. And some background in Costa Rica is they have a larger white majority population than most countries in Latin America. And that's kind of something that becomes a part of the Costa Rican identity. So this quote says, "We don't have any indigenous people here. We're pure." And the next quote says, "We don't have illiteracy here. The women here are beautiful and they have beautiful features. And in other countries, they're just, they're more like Indians." Ouch, because I am what they would call an Indian. But these statements, they really do signal racial hierarchies and divisions within Latin America that marginalize women who fall outside of that category of white. And this kind of leads me to discuss cultural gaslighting within a settler colonial society, because the discourse surrounding sex tourism in Latin America, it doesn't usually include the voices of the racialized and marginalized women. Because sensationalist news headlines and the moral panics that, come after, they usually silence the women central to the trade, the women working in this trade, and it reinforces systemic violence that they already face and systemic discrimination. And these narratives, they further stigmatize and empower those systems that drive these women to see this work as their only viable option in the first place, because it doesn't, these sensationalist headlines, they never tackle those structural or racial hierarchies. So ultimately, these women's voices, they become erased. And in the eyes of society, they're both victims who are taken advantage of and exploited, but then also deviants who are immoral and taking part in, wrong and sexually deviant behavior. And instead of addressing these structural issues, which include racial hierarchies and social class, the discourse, it always fixates on ideas that are built on the notions of white purity, and it ignores the fundamental socioeconomic forces at play for women of color. And these racial hierarchies, these intersectionalities, and these social ideas of race, they extend beyond Latin America, which is why the European and American white men travel there in the first place, because they perceive the women there to be, they stereotype them and they see them as inherently sexual, mysterious, and exotic. And this exoticization, it really influences the relationships and the actions that these women take, because they have to put extensive effort into their appearance. And, so for example, this is done to keep up this fantasy. Carol from Gringo Love intentionally tans herself darker to fit that idea of a beautiful morena, which basically means, morena, it means, brown woman, which can be reused to refer to a woman who is brunette or mixed race, black, or indigenous. Or, side note, like the women in Costa Rica, they don't see themselves as white, but they're exoticized and they kind of extensively maintain their appearance. And regardless of the self-perception they have of their race, the men's perception kind of takes precedency in their appearance. And beauty-based labor. And I just want to say one quick thing about beauty-based labor in Costa Rica, which kind of takes us to economics, and class separation, is a lot of the women, they will put a lot of importance on their appearance with the gifts and money that they get. They'll buy new clothing and forming these relationships as well with the men, emotional bonds, and seeing their work as a service rather than sex work. They don't see it as sex work, and they usually use it to create that divide and that barrier between them and women who work in brothels, who they say they see as the real sex workers and who they actually pity, which I think is really interesting, because there's definitely, getting that divide gets created. So I just wanted to bring that up, so that way we could kind of see how these women perceive themselves in society and how they perceive their relationships and the work they do, and kind of just also dive into how they perceive class as well. Alright, now keeping with the theme of culture, race, and gender, I want to talk about the cultural concept called machismo. So machismo, what is it? It basically boils down to male dominance over women. And this can include, which I've read in the ethnographies, acts of violence, so abuse, physical abuse, infidelity, and verbal abuse. And, verbal abuse, like Carol in the ethnography Gringo Love talks about, Brazilian men calling women whores. And, that's verbally abusive and can be really emotionally traumatizing for some women, and these negative experiences can really influence how they see local men and how they see tourist men in comparison to one another. So an example is of how they see local men is Elena, who expresses that she says, men cheat, like Dominican men cheat, they have multiple families, and they drink. And Carol and her friend Luna, who also works in sex tourism, states, Brazilian men, they're too macho and abusive. So, these are pretty negative perceptions of Dominican and Brazilian men and Latin American men in general. They call them machistas. And, these perceived failings of these men really contribute to framing the white tourist men as being able to treat a woman right. And, they acknowledge that some of these men aren't the greatest sometimes. Carol says that sometimes gringos can be assholes, but her friend Luna goes back and says, well, not when they love you. And you see that theme of love comes back up again because it's so important for them when they're interacting with these men and trying to create those connections and relationships. But back to their flaws, despite these tourist men's flaws, the perceptions of them being good men in comparison kind of persist. And, so like an example is Elena and her friends stating that Jürgen, who is Elena's German ex, he was a tourist, and they say that he was a good man, but the reality is he cheated and he drank and he abandoned their child. But ultimately these men, like their positive behaviors, their previous positive behaviors of paying these women, being nice to these women, and being kind, they kind of become associated with being white men. And these white men come to represent a lot more. They come to represent social mobility, and it's really shown through their temporary love and care and the financial support, and it causes them to see these men more positively in comparison to the local Latin American men. And that really impacts what they tolerate from the tourist men. And some of these women might never have experienced before being so close, because they form these relationships, they might never have experienced being so close to economic and social mobility, or that previously mentioned love and care, because of the machismo that they experience in other relationships. And this can also translate to beyond personal relationships, but structural factors that suppress them as women and kind of subordinate them. Alright, so what do I mean when I keep talking about structural inequalities? Well, I'm really talking about intersectionality and those identities that come together and create barriers that are unique to Latin American women in the Dominican Republic, Brazil, and in general Latin America. Because it creates barriers to accessing needed resources, and I wouldn't even say economic freedom, but at least economic comfortability to survive. So, talking about economics, let's turn to the Dominican Republic, because a lot of men lost their jobs when there was a boost in tourism focus in the economy rather than a focus on agriculture, because a main export of the Dominican was sugar for a while. But this led to a lot of men losing their jobs and meant that more women had to enter the labor force, leading to a feminization of labor. And families really became reliant on women's income and jobs. So, yeah, but the thing is, there were a lot of barriers to education. And the globalization of the 90s, well, it didn't offer great paying jobs. It offered a lot of low paying jobs that were difficult. Like factory jobs in the Dominican, I'm sure in Brazil too, domestic labor in Brazil and Dominican as well. And the thing is that these didn't really pay well. they weren't enough to really sustain a family. And a lot of these women are doing this to sustain a family or to sustain themselves. And at best, these jobs were yielding like $83 US a month. And that pales in comparison to the $17 to $20 a woman can make, $25 a woman can make in just one sexual encounter with a tourist man. So now imagine a relationship. Like, that's gonna seem like a whole lot of a better economic situation for these women, which, is going to lead women to want to do that work instead of the low-paying, difficult jobs. So, what more can we talk about when it comes to this? Well, I think we should talk about the lacking opportunities and especially the lacking support systems for impoverished families, women, and girls, because it creates situations where sex work is their only real option to sustain any level of survival. And as I said, I don't want to glamorize this trade. It's not all love, because girls as young as like 14, such as Mirabel from Sosua, Dominican Republic, who I read about in Denise Brennan's ethnography called What's Love Got to Do with It? Well, she worked in the sex trade with her sisters and was a single mother herself. And she received very little child support. And the thing is, it is illegal in the Dominican for men not to pay child support, but the law is just not very consistently enforced. So that means that women have to, repeatedly report the father to jail, to the police for child support, which is a burden. Because why would she want to continuously do that? That's a lot of work to do. She already has to sustain a child. Now she has to deal with reporting someone to the police all the time. So, yeah, sex work is going to seem like a better option again. And if the concern is child exploitation or sexual exploitation, well, we're going to need to talk about the impact of globalization then, because it relies on supplying low-paying jobs to the global south for the economic prosperity of the north in places like Canada, Europe, and the US. And this is where a lot of the men coincidentally come from. And now when you're impoverished, there becomes a decrease in the need for education and the increase in the need of survival. And work is associated with survival. And it causes women and young girls to choose working over school. And sometimes they'll drop out and join the labor force and decide that this is not paying me well enough and that sex work would be more financially prosperous, and it becomes really their only viable option to support themselves, their families, and kids at times. So without tackling the systems that make it difficult for these women to access resources and economic comfortability, without tackling that, and when discussing sex tourism and exploitation, we don't get a full picture, and we only provide a stigmatizing, sensationalist discussion without discussing the actual factors and systems that allow for this work to persist in the first place. We really provide a surface level discussion when we don't tackle those systems and structures. So now that we're nearing the end of our podcast, I want to end us off on a comparative analysis with how race and citizenship and economic status can influence a woman's experience in sex tourism. So, similarly to the men, women who participate as clients are usually white European American women who travel for sex, expecting to pay for it with an exchange of goods or money. And these women are usually traveling to the Caribbean, and they seek out black men in particular. And, similarly to the racialized women in sex tourism, the black men in these situations also blur the lines of intimacy by including kissing, massages, and spending general quality time with these women. And these women, they like to travel to these places up to 3 times a year while having children. And now let's think, that's a huge contrast of the women who are working as sex workers, who are usually working for their children or for their families. So this is a huge contrast in the privilege that these women have. And it signals that these women are probably really well off to be able to leave their children in their home countries and come here. To come to Jamaica, well, I'm not in Jamaica, I didn't mean here, but go to Jamaica, And here's the thing is, these women, they still feel very undesired, the women who are acting as clients, and they don't feel very much in control. Well, they travel to places like Jamaica to feel in control and to have that empowerment. And a woman stated, women who come to Jamaica, well, they like control, so she's admitting it. And they don't need a man in their lives, well, except for sex. And they don't need them for money, just sex, because they can do that for them. They can't do that for themselves. And it's better to have someone uneducated who acts like a lackey and is in your control, so you can say when it starts and when it stops. And another excerpt that says, I'm not coming to live and set up a house with a guy. I just want to have some fun and good sex. Now, this completely contrasts what Brazilian women and Dominican women are telling us, that they need love in their relationships. Well, this is a complete contrast. And now let's remember, Elena broke down crying after finding out that her German boyfriend was leaving. And the thing is, these women, they often feel, these client women, they feel very empowered and in control because of their citizenship in places like Canada and the US and other countries in Europe, because they've been given opportunities that Latin American women have been denied by virtue of being women of color, single mothers, and from the global South. So this difference in socioeconomic class, race, and citizenship, well, it just goes to show how much these factors can really impact the experiences of women in sex tourism, both as sex workers and clients. Because we really see just how much power you have in these situations based on these factors. All right, so we have gone through a lot together, spanning from emotional labor and how important it is to legitimize these relationships, not just for the men, but for the women themselves. Dealing with social stigma, structural barriers, and inequalities which push women into sex tourism work, and also racial hierarchies and cultural constructs, machismo, and exoticism. And we just kind of got to see how these all come together and influence the experiences that these women have. And we also drew on the comparison of white women who act as clients to black men. And that was particularly important to see how citizenship, race, and socioeconomic class can really change that experience and change that shift of power for women in this setting. So I think that what we've really been able to learn here from listening to excerpts from women like Carol, Perla, and Elena is that sex tourism is just so much more than that one-time interaction. It's a set of strategic decisions that are meant to intentionally navigate and resist the structural and cultural barriers that are put into place to subjugate these women, making it difficult for them to really survive. And these women, while they're in a really, really difficult situation, they work within the system as active participants, seeking economic stability, social mobility, and love in the mix. And without centering our podcast today on the voices of these women or their perspectives, we might not have gained the more profound understanding that we have now. And, we might not have understood sex tourism better and the women behind the news headlines. And I want to take us back to the question I asked in the beginning of what does it mean to love, to labor emotionally, and survive economically in a world shaped by race, class, and gender? And I think we can agree that the answer is not that simple, because patriarchy, as we saw with the experience of white women, well, it's not monolithic experiences. It's not a monolithic experience, and neither is economic struggle or love. But what we can draw from this is that it's all deeply complex and very human. And I hope that after this podcast episode, that we can walk away not with judgment or pity, but with open minds that are always curious and open and ready to learn and listen to the stories of marginalized people. And I also hope that we begin to examine how structural forces like colonialism, racism, and economic inequalities are embedded in our everyday lives and how they impact romance and stability. And I want to challenge you to see where you're positioned in the world and what impacts you and how you impact others. Well, thank you so much for joining me on today's journey. It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoyed this episode. All right, well, I'm Amy, and this has been Sex, Love, and Tourism, an experience of mobility. And until next time, stay curious and remain critical.